Here's something they never told you about D-Day. The first man off the landing craft at Omaha Beach wasn't carrying a rifle. He had no grenades, no ammunition, no way to fight back. What he did carry would save more lives in the next 3 hours than an entire infantry platoon could in a week. His name was Staff Sergeant Ray Lambert, and attached to his belt was a canvas bag that German machine gunners specifically targeted. The red cross on his armband wasn't protection. It was a death sentence. Enemy snipers had learned a brutal truth. Kill one medic, and you kill dozens of soldiers who would have been saved. But here's the twist that changes everything you think you know about courage. Lambert and thousands of men like him ran toward the screaming, toward the blood, toward death itself, completely unarmed. When every instinct screamed to hit the ground and hide, medics stood up. When shells exploded and bullets cut through the air, medics exposed themselves to reach the wounded. They weren't protected by body armor or weapons, just compassion. Just a handful of morphine syrettes and a desperate belief that one more life could be saved. And before that morning was over, Lambert would be hit at least 3 times. His arm shattered by a bullet. His leg opened to the bone. A landing craft would crush his spine, yet he kept pulling men from the surf, kept bandaging wounds, kept working until he physically couldn't move. Of the 31 men who landed with him, only 7 would survive the day. But that's not the most remarkable part of his story. Or theirs. Because across 2 oceans and countless battlefields, tens of thousands of young men, most of them teenagers, were doing the impossible. They were performing emergency surgery in muddy foxholes under artillery fire, making split-second choices about who would live and who would die, carrying wounded soldiers through minefields, treating injuries so horrific they defied description, all while carrying no weapons to defend themselves. Think about that for a moment. While their fellow soldiers loaded rifles and fixed bayonets, medics carried bandages. While others trained to kill, they trained to heal. The medic occupied perhaps the strangest position in military history, officially non-combatants under the Geneva Conventions, yet positioned at the absolute front of battle. That Red Cross armband? In theory, it meant protection. In practice, it often meant enemy forces knew exactly who to target first. Take out the medic, and every other soldier in the unit knew something terrifying. If they fell, no one might come. Yet they came anyway. Farm boys from Iowa who'd never seen blood outside a slaughtered pig. College students who'd dreamed of medical school, but ended up with a far more brutal education. Factory workers who'd been assembling cars and now had to reassemble shattered human bodies. Some were drafted, told they'd scored high enough on aptitude tests to become medics. Others volunteered, though few understood what they were volunteering for. The war would test them in ways they could never have imagined. They would perform emergency surgery in muddy foxholes under artillery fire. They would make split-second decisions about who lived and who died, knowing that choosing to help one man meant leaving another to bleed out alone. They would carry wounded soldiers across minefields, administer morphine with shaking hands, hold dying men, and lie to them that everything would be okay. This is their story, not the sanitized version found in newsreels or propaganda posters, but the real, raw truth of what it meant to be a combat medic on the front lines of history's deadliest war. It's a story of remarkable courage and heartbreaking loss, of medical innovation born from desperation, and of young men who faced hell armed with nothing but compassion and a canvas bag of supplies. They saved hundreds of thousands of lives. They witnessed unspeakable horrors. Many never came home, and those who did carried the weight of what they'd seen for the rest of their lives. The sun rises over a military training base somewhere in America, 1942. The year is still early in the war. Pearl Harbor's smoke has barely cleared. Young men are flooding into recruitment centers by the thousands, eager to fight, to prove themselves, to be part of something larger than their small-town lives. But among them walk others, quieter perhaps, who will take a different path. These are the men who will become medics. Their war will be just as brutal, just as deadly, but fundamentally different. Because while their comrades load rifles and fix bayonets, these men will learn to save life rather than take it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before anyone could run into enemy fire to drag a wounded soldier to safety, before anyone could perform battlefield surgery with primitive tools in primitive conditions, they first had to become medics. They had to undergo a transformation, both physical and psychological, that would prepare them for the hardest job in the entire military. And that transformation began with training. Training that was intense, inadequate, and absolutely essential all at once. Becoming a combat medic, training and selection. The path to becoming a combat medic began long before anyone set foot on a battlefield. In the early days of the war, as the military rapidly expanded, the medical department faced an enormous challenge. They needed to train thousands of medics, and they needed to do it quickly. The problem was that most of the young men arriving at training camps had no medical background whatsoever. They were farmers and factory workers, high school graduates and college dropouts. Very few had ever given medical treatment beyond putting a bandage on a scraped knee. The Medical Replacement Training Centers, or MRTCs, were established to address this need. By 1941, 3 centers were already operational, with more to follow. These facilities took raw recruits and attempted to transform them into functioning medical personnel in a matter of weeks. It was an ambitious goal, perhaps an impossible one, but the alternative was sending men into combat without any medical support at all. Training began, as it did for all soldiers, with basic military preparation. Even though medics wouldn't carry weapons in combat, they still needed to know how to march, how to follow orders, how to survive in military life. They learned dismounted drill, military courtesy, individual defense, and protection. They learned how to dig foxholes, how to wear gas masks, how to read maps. Because while their primary role would be medical, they were still soldiers first, and they needed to be able to function in a combat environment. But the heart of their training was, of course, medical. This is where the real challenge began. How do you teach someone with no medical background to perform emergency treatment in a matter of weeks? The answer, as imperfect as it was, involved intensive classroom instruction combined with hands-on practice. Trainees learned anatomy and physiology in rapid-fire sessions. They studied the circulatory system, the respiratory system, the nervous system. They learned about shock and hemorrhage, about fractures and burns, about the 1,000 different ways a human body could be broken by modern warfare. The curriculum focused heavily on practical skills. Trainees spent hours learning to apply bandages, splint broken limbs, and administer injections. They practiced on each other, taking turns playing wounded soldier and medic. They learned to work quickly, because in combat, speed often meant the difference between life and death. A soldier bleeding from a severed artery had minutes, not hours. A sucking chest wound needed immediate attention, or the casualty would drown in his own blood. There was no time for hesitation, no room for squeamishness. One of the most critical skills they learned was the proper use of morphine. The morphine syrette became the combat medic's most important tool. These small tubes, topped with a needle and filled with morphine tartrate, could ease unbearable pain and help a wounded man survive long enough to reach surgical care. But morphine was also dangerous. Too much could suppress respiration and kill an already weakened patient. In cold weather, poor circulation could delay absorption, leading medics to give repeated doses that would all hit the system at once when the casualty was warmed up, causing a fatal overdose. Medics learned to attach the used syrette to the casualty's collar or jacket, a simple but vital communication method to prevent other medical personnel from administering additional morphine downstream. They learned about sulfur drugs, the antibiotic wonder of the early war years. Before penicillin became widely available, sulfur powder was sprinkled directly into wounds to prevent infection. It wasn't perfect, but it saved countless lives. Trainees practiced opening packets of sulfur with one hand while holding pressure on a wound with the other, building the muscle memory they'd need when their hands were slick with blood and their ears were ringing from artillery concussions. Tourniquets were another essential skill. In World War I, tourniquet use had been controversial, often leading to unnecessary amputations. But by World War II, medical doctrine had evolved. A tourniquet was now recognized as an appropriate and potentially life-saving intervention for severe extremity hemorrhage. Medics learned where to place them, high and tight, above the wound, and when to use them, understanding that this was a treatment for the most severe bleeding, not for every wound. Plasma administration became another crucial skill. The development of dried plasma represented one of the major medical advances of the war. Unlike whole blood, plasma didn't require blood type matching and could be stored without refrigeration. Mixed with sterile water, it could be administered to a patient in shock, buying time for more definitive care. Medics learned the entire procedure, preparing the solution, finding a vein in a traumatized patient, establishing the intravenous line, monitoring the flow. It was delicate work under ideal conditions. In combat, covered in mud, under fire, with hands shaking from cold or fear, it became an act of desperation and skill combined. But technical knowledge was only part of the preparation. Perhaps more challenging was the psychological conditioning. How do you prepare someone for the horror of battlefield medicine? How do you ready them for the moment when they'll kneel beside a screaming soldier whose legs have been blown off? When they'll have to look into the eyes of a dying man and make the split-second decision to move on to someone more salvageable? No amount of classroom training could truly prepare a person for that. Some training programs attempted to simulate combat conditions. Trainees crawled through obstacle courses while instructors fired live ammunition overhead. They performed medical tasks while explosions detonated nearby, while smoke obscured their vision, while noise and chaos swirled around them. It was meant to acclimatize them to working under stress, to teach them to focus on the medical task even when every instinct screamed at them to seek cover. Yet even these simulations fell short of reality in ways that would only become apparent under actual fire. There was no way to replicate the smell of burning flesh mixed with cordite and seawater, the sound of a man choking on his own blood while calling for his mother, the sight of intestines spilling from a torn abdomen while the wounded soldier remained conscious and aware. There was no way to prepare for the moral weight of triage, the moment when a medic would have to look at two wounded men and consciously choose to treat one while knowing the other would likely die from that delay. Some things could only be learned on the battlefield itself, and what many medics discovered there would challenge everything they thought they knew about medicine, about humanity, and about themselves. But here's something the training manuals never addressed, something that emerges clearly from post-war accounts and would later prove crucial to understanding the medic's experience. The medics who adapted best to combat weren't always the ones with the most medical knowledge or the best test scores. Often, they were the ones who could remain emotionally present without becoming emotionally overwhelmed. Men who could care deeply about each casualty while simultaneously maintaining enough psychological distance to keep functioning. This balance, impossible to teach in a classroom, would prove more valuable than any technical skill. But it came with a cost that no one understood at the time. the ability to remain emotionally connected to suffering, to never become numb, to always see each casualty as a human being rather than just a medical problem, was exactly what made medics effective. It was also, as researchers would discover decades later, what would leave the deepest scars. Remember this. It becomes important later in ways no one could have predicted in 1942. The length of training varied throughout the war, revealing an uncomfortable truth about military preparedness. Early in the conflict, with a desperate need for medical personnel, some men received only a few weeks of instruction before being shipped overseas, barely enough time to master basic bandaging, let alone complex medical procedures. By mid-war, as the system became more organized and planners better understood the demands of combat medicine, training extended to 16 weeks at facilities like Fort Sam Houston's Medical Replacement Training Center. But even this extended training was never long enough to fully prepare men for what they'd face. Many medics would later recall arriving at their first combat assignment feeling woefully unprepared, a sentiment captured in numerous oral history interviews conducted decades later. They'd learned the textbook definitions, practiced the procedures on willing volunteers in controlled environments, but nothing could have readied them for performing those same procedures on screaming, bleeding soldiers while under enemy fire, while exhausted beyond measure, while their hands shook from adrenaline and fear. What's remarkable, and this emerges clearly from analyzing the medical records and survival statistics, is how quickly these undertrained young men learned and adapted once in the field. They developed techniques not found in any manual, improvised solutions to problems their instructors had never imagined, and shared innovations through informal networks that spread life-saving practices faster than official channels ever could. For instance, medics quickly learned that the official doctrine for treating shock didn't account for the reality of treating multiple casualties simultaneously with limited plasma supplies. They adapted by identifying which patients needed plasma immediately to survive versus those who could wait, a practice that would later be formalized as modern triage protocols. Similarly, the technique of attaching used morphine syrettes to a casualty's collar, nowhere in the official training but universally adopted in the field, emerged from tragic experience when soldiers received fatal overdoses after multiple medics, unaware of previous doses, administered additional morphine. These adaptations suggest something significant. Combat medicine advanced not primarily through official medical research, but through the collective, desperate innovation of thousands of young medics solving immediate problems under impossible conditions. The knowledge gained in foxholes and aid stations would only later be systematized into formal doctrine. One particular challenge was the selection of who would become medics in the first place. And here's where military planning revealed an unexpected blind spot. The military needed large numbers of medical personnel, but it also needed combat troops. Ideally, medics would be intelligent enough to master complex medical procedures, calm under pressure, physically fit enough to carry wounded soldiers, and possessed of some medical knowledge or at least genuine interest in healing. In reality, the assignment often came down to test scores, availability, and the seemingly arbitrary needs of the service at any given moment. Some men specifically requested medical service, either from a genuine desire to help others or, and this was rarely openly acknowledged, from a hope that being a medic might be less dangerous than being infantry. Those who believed this would discover their error within minutes of their first combat engagement. Others found themselves assigned to medical training based on aptitude test results that identified them as suitable for technical roles. A farmer's son who'd spent his life working with animals might score high on practical problem solving and find himself training to treat human casualties. A college student studying literature might demonstrate enough intelligence to master anatomy and suddenly become responsible for emergency surgery. But here's the reveal that changes our understanding of combat medicine. Post-war analysis would show that the men who volunteered for medical service out of a desire to avoid combat typically didn't last long as effective medics. The psychological toll of being unarmed while under fire, combined with witnessing constant suffering without the outlet of being able to fight back, broke them faster than it broke many infantrymen. By contrast, those who'd genuinely wanted to help, who felt called to healing rather than driven there by fear, demonstrated remarkable resilience even under the worst conditions. This suggests something profound about human psychology under extreme stress. The motivation that brings you to a role matters more than the role itself. A medic who saw his work as meaningful, as saving lives rather than merely avoiding taking them, could endure trauma that would shatter someone performing the identical tasks, but from different motivations. The Army's selection process, focused on aptitude and availability, largely missed this crucial variable. Conscientious objectors represented a unique category. Men whose religious or ethical beliefs prevented them from bearing arms could serve as medics, where their compassion could save lives without requiring them to kill. These men often faced ridicule and suspicion during basic training. Fellow soldiers called them cowards, questioned their courage, sometimes subjected them to harassment or physical abuse. But many of these conscientious objectors would go on to display extraordinary valor in combat, proving that courage comes in many forms. The relationship between medics and the soldiers they served began forming during training. In many cases, medics trained alongside the infantry units they would eventually support. They learned to work as teams, building the trust that would be essential in combat. Infantry learned to recognize their medic, to know that if they fell, this was the man who would come for them. And medics learned the personalities of the soldiers in their care, began to see them as individuals rather than just potential casualties. As training drew to a close and units prepared for deployment, the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in. These young men, most still teenagers, were about to be sent into the largest, most destructive war in human history. They would board transport ships bound for North Africa, or England, or the Pacific. They would travel thousands of miles from home to places they'd never heard of, where they'd face challenges they couldn't imagine. And through it all, they'd be unarmed, relying on nothing but their training, their courage, and the hope that the Red Cross armband they wore would mean something to the enemy they'd face. But before we follow them into combat, we need to understand the tools they carried, because the medic's effectiveness ultimately came down to what was in his aid bag and how well he knew how to use it. In the next section, we'll examine the equipment that combat medics carried into battle: the morphine syrettes, the bandages, the plasma, the simple tools that represented the thin line between life and death for thousands of wounded soldiers. These items, mundane as they might seem, were the weapons medics wielded in their war against death itself. The medic's tools, equipment, and procedures under fire. The weight on a combat medic's back told its own story. While infantry carried rifles, ammunition, grenades, and all the implements of destruction, medics bore a different burden. Their load was dedicated entirely to preservation: bandages, drugs, plasma, instruments. Every item had been carefully chosen, tested, refined through years of military medical evolution. And every item might mean the difference between a soldier living or dying. At the heart of every medic's equipment was the medical aid bag, typically a canvas pouch that could be worn over the shoulder or attached to a belt. The bag's contents varied somewhat depending on theater and period of the war, but certain essentials remained constant. Let's open one of these bags and examine what a typical combat medic carried into battle. First, bandages. Not just one or two, but dozens. The most common was the first aid dressing, a thick pad of absorbent material attached to a long strip of cloth, that could be wrapped around a limb or torso. These came in individual packages designed to be opened quickly with one hand, essential when the other hand was holding pressure on a bleeding wound. Medics carried multiple sizes, from small dressings for minor wounds to larger ones capable of covering extensive injuries. Many also carried triangular bandages, versatile pieces of cloth that could be folded and tied in numerous configurations to serve as slings, head bandages, or emergency tourniquets. Compressed gauze was another staple. Packed tightly into small boxes, this material could be pulled out in long strips for packing deep wounds. When a soldier was struck by shrapnel or a bullet that created a cavity in his flesh, simply covering the outside wasn't enough. The wound needed to be packed to control deep bleeding and prevent air pockets where infection could flourish. Medics would stuff gauze into these cavities, working quickly while the soldier screamed in pain, knowing this immediate treatment could save a limb or a life. Adhesive tape served countless purposes. It secured bandages, held splints in place, and could even seal certain types of chest wounds to prevent air from being sucked into the chest cavity, a condition called tension pneumothorax that could quickly kill. The tape came in rolls that would stick even to skin slick with blood or muddy water, another small innovation that had been refined through bitter experience in previous wars. Tourniquets evolved significantly during the war. Early versions were simple strips of material with a rod for twisting to apply pressure. By late in the war, elastic tourniquets had been introduced, easier to apply and less likely to cause unnecessary tissue damage. Medics carried these prominently, often attached to the outside of their kit where they could be accessed in seconds. A severed artery could drain a man's blood volume in minutes. The tourniquet, properly applied, could buy that man crucial time. Then came the drugs. The morphine syringe was the most iconic. These small tubes, typically holding 1.5 cubic centimeters of morphine tartrate, were topped with a needle and protected by a plastic cap. To use one, a medic would remove the cap, stick the needle into a muscle, the thigh, the upper arm, or the abdomen were common sites, and squeeze the tube to inject the drug. The empty syringe was then attached to the casualty's collar or uniform to signal that morphine had been given. This simple communication system prevented dangerous overdoses as wounded men moved through the evacuation chain. Morphine's effects were profound. Within 20 to 30 minutes of injection, severe pain would diminish, shock would ease, and a screaming, thrashing casualty would calm enough to be moved. For many wounded soldiers, morphine represented their first moment of relief from unimaginable agony. Some medics carried dozens of syringes in their bags, knowing they'd need everyone in a major engagement. But morphine had to be used judiciously. It depressed respiration, which could be fatal in a patient already struggling to breathe. It was contraindicated in head injuries, where it could mask important neurological symptoms. And as mentioned earlier, in cold conditions, it could accumulate in poorly circulating tissue only to flood the system later with potentially lethal results. Good medics learned to assess quickly. Is this patient in severe pain? Is the pain affecting their stability? Can they breathe adequately? Only then would they reach for the morphine. Sulfur drugs represented the next chemical weapon in the medic's arsenal against death. Before the widespread availability of penicillin, sulfanilamide and sulfadiazine were the primary antibiotics. These came in multiple forms. Sulfanilamide powder could be sprinkled directly into open wounds. The white crystals would dissolve into the blood and tissue, fighting infection at the source. Sulfadiazine came in tablet form, meant to be taken orally to provide systemic antibiotic coverage. The use of sulfur drugs in World War II represented a major advance over World War I, when infection killed as many soldiers as combat injuries themselves. A wound that would have turned gangrenous and fatal in 1918 could now be treated and healed by 1944, provided sulfur was administered early and consistently. Medics learned to be generous with the powder, coating every wound they dressed. The slight sting was nothing compared to the protection it offered. Plasma was perhaps the most significant addition to the medics' capabilities. The development of dried plasma, which could be stored without refrigeration and mixed with sterile water when needed, revolutionized battlefield medicine. Plasma addressed the immediate problem of shock, the cardiovascular collapse that occurred when too much blood was lost. By restoring fluid volume, plasma bought time for the body's remaining blood to continue delivering oxygen to vital organs. Each plasma package came with distilled water in one bottle and dried plasma in another. When mixed, the solution was ready in about 3 minutes. Administering it required establishing an intravenous line, which meant finding a vein in an injured, often dehydrated patient, then carefully inserting a needle and securing it in place. This was delicate work in a hospital. On a battlefield, covered in mud, with hands shaking and mortars falling nearby, it was incredibly difficult. Yet medics mastered it, establishing hundreds of thousands of IV lines under the most adverse conditions imaginable. Beyond these primary items, medics carried a host of other supplies: iodine swabs for disinfecting skin before injections, scissors for cutting away clothing to expose wounds, safety pins for securing bandages, burn injury sets containing special dressings for soldiers hit by flame weapons or caught in burning vehicles, eye dressing sets for injuries from shell fragments or chemical exposure. Each item had its specific use. Each had been deemed essential enough to carry into combat despite the weight. As the war progressed, equipment evolved. New items were added based on battlefield experience. The burn injury set wasn't part of early medic kits, but was introduced after experience showed how common burn injuries were in modern mechanized warfare. Field tourniquets improved, bandage configurations changed. The military medical establishment, for all its bureaucratic slowness, did learn and adapt. Special situations required special equipment. Airborne medics, who would parachute into combat zones, received specially designed kits that could be dropped alongside them. These parachutist medical kits contained similar supplies, but in more robust packaging designed to survive the drop and landing. They also included additional morphine syrettes and plasma packages, knowing that airborne operations often left men cut off from resupply for extended periods. Medics in the Pacific Theater received jungle medical kits with supplies specific to tropical warfare. These included insect repellent, water purification tablets, anti-malarial drugs, and treatments for tropical diseases like dengue fever. The jungle kit also contained snakebite kits, recognition that in the dense forests of New Guinea or the Philippines, a cobra or pit viper could be as deadly as any Japanese soldier. For major operations, particularly amphibious assaults like D-Day, special waterproof supply units were developed. Medical supplies were packed into waxed mortar shell cases that could survive immersion during beach landings. These cases, carried ashore by aid men in the first waves, contained additional bandages, morphine, plasma, sulfur drugs, and other essentials to supplement what individual medics carried in their personal aid bags. But equipment was only half the equation. The other half was knowledge, knowing not just what these tools did, but when and how to use them. This is where training met reality, where the classroom lessons had to be applied under conditions of absolute chaos. Consider the basic task of stopping bleeding. In principle, it's simple: apply pressure. But which wound do you address first when a soldier has 3 different injuries bleeding? How much pressure is enough when you're also trying to reassure a terrified casualty while simultaneously watching for enemy movement that might threaten both of you? And what do you do when direct pressure isn't enough? When blood continues pumping out despite your best efforts? Medics learned a triage process, though often it was more instinctive than formal. Arterial bleeding, bright red blood spurting in time with the heartbeat, demanded immediate attention. A severed artery could kill in minutes. This warranted a tourniquet, applied high and tight, twisted until bleeding stopped completely. Venous bleeding, darker blood flowing steadily, was less immediately lethal, but still dangerous. This could often be controlled with direct pressure and a pressure dressing. Capillary bleeding, oozing from abraded tissue, was the least urgent, often requiring nothing more than a simple dressing. Chest wounds presented unique challenges. A sucking chest wound, where a hole in the chest wall allowed air to enter the pleural space, could collapse a lung and kill rapidly. The treatment was to seal the wound, often with nothing more sophisticated than a piece of plastic or the waterproof wrapper from a bandage taped down on 3 sides to create a one-way valve. Air could escape, but not enter. This simple intervention, which could be performed in seconds, saved countless lives. Abdominal wounds were among the most dreaded. Penetrating injuries to the abdomen could damage intestines, liver, spleen, or major blood vessels. There was little a medic could do beyond covering exposed organs with a moist dressing, administering morphine, and evacuating the casualty as quickly as possible. These soldiers needed surgery, and they needed it fast. A medic's job was simply to keep them alive long enough to reach an operating table. Head wounds varied enormously in severity. A scalp laceration might bleed profusely but be relatively minor, requiring only a pressure bandage. But a penetrating head wound, where shrapnel or a bullet had entered the skull, was often unsurvivable with 1940s medical technology. Medics learned to recognize the signs: altered consciousness, unequal pupils, specific breathing patterns that indicated severe brain injury. These casualties received morphine for comfort, but were often, heartbreakingly, deemed expectant, meaning they were expected to die regardless of treatment. Fractures required stabilization. A simple broken arm could be splinted with boards or even rolled up magazines. Anything rigid secured with bandages or tape. More complex fractures, particularly of the femur, required more elaborate splinting to prevent the broken bone ends from severing major blood vessels during evacuation. Compound fractures, where bone had broken through skin, needed all the treatment of an open wound: cleaning, sulfur powder, bandaging, in addition to stabilization. Burns demanded special care. Battlefield burns came from flame weapons, burning vehicles, or white phosphorus shells that ignited on contact with air. The treatment had evolved significantly from World War I. Gone were attempts to treat burns with tannic acid, which had been found to cause more harm than good. Now, the approach emphasized preventing infection, managing pain, and rapid evacuation. Burn injury sets contained petroleum jelly gauze that wouldn't stick to damaged tissue and could be applied to cover the burned area while the casualty was transported to a hospital. Throughout all of this, medics had to remember their own survival. Unlike their infantry comrades, they carried no weapons. Their protection was supposedly their non-combatant status, marked by the Red Cross armband. But theory and reality diverged sharply. Many enemy soldiers, particularly in the Pacific Theater, ignored this convention. German soldiers were generally more likely to respect medical personnel, though not universally. Japanese forces, operating under a different military culture that viewed surrender as dishonorable, often targeted medics deliberately. This led to a grim calculation that reveals something unexpected about the so-called rules of war. Some medics removed their Red Cross markings entirely, hoping to blend in with regular troops and avoid becoming deliberate targets. But this created its own terrible dilemma. Wounded soldiers, scanning desperately through smoke and chaos for help, might not recognize their medic when seconds mattered most. It also meant surrendering the theoretical protections of the Geneva Conventions, thin as those protections proved to be. Historical records suggest each medic had to make this choice for himself, weighing risks that had no good answer. German forces generally, though not universally, respected medical personnel markings. In the Pacific, however, captured Japanese training documents would later reveal that soldiers had been specifically instructed to target medics, viewing it as tactically advantageous to eliminate the enemy's medical capability. This wasn't a breakdown in civilized warfare, it was deliberate strategy. The implications were brutal. A medic's compassion made him valuable to his unit, but also made him a priority target. The same armband meant to protect him might be what got him killed. Then came the waiting for resupply, the anxiety of knowing the next engagement might come before he could fully re-equip. And here's an unexpected truth that emerged from analyzing medical records after the war. Morphine shortages didn't always correlate with casualty numbers. Sometimes medics ran out quickly because they used it generously, trying to ease every wounded soldier's suffering. Other times, medics hoarded it, using it sparingly because they'd learned through bitter experience that running out meant facing wounded men with nothing to offer but empty promises. This created an impossible ethical calculus. Use morphine generously now, and you might save suffering for 20 men while having nothing for the 21st. Save it for only the most severe cases, and you inflict unnecessary agony on soldiers who could have been helped. Medical doctrine provided no guidance for this. It couldn't. There was no right answer, only choices that haunted medics for decades afterward. But the equipment and the supplies, essential as they were ultimately just tools. What truly mattered was the person wielding them. The young man, often barely out of his teens, who had to make life and death decisions with incomplete information and inadequate resources, who had to function while exhausted, terrified, and traumatized himself. In the next section, we'll examine what that actually looked like by following medics through one of the war's most famous operations, the D-Day landings at Normandy. There, on the beaches and in the bocage hedgerows beyond, we'll see how training and equipment met the ultimate test of actual combat. Into the storm, D-Day and the Normandy campaign. Dawn was still hours away on June 6, 1944, when Staff Sergeant Ray Lambert made his way through the crowded troop compartment of a landing ship anchored off the Normandy coast. At 24, Lambert was a veteran of the North African and Sicilian campaigns, already decorated with a Silver Star for valor. He led a 30-man medical detachment from the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the famed Big Red One. They were about to make their third amphibious assault of the war, but this one would dwarf everything that had come before. Lambert found his brother Bill in the pre-dawn darkness. Both men were medics in the same regiment, about to land on the same beach. They shared a moment, just two brothers from Alabama who had somehow ended up here, about to storm a fortified shore under the guns of the German Atlantic Wall. "This is going to be the worst yet," Ray told his brother. They each promised to look after the other's family if one of them didn't make it back. Then they parted, heading to their separate landing craft. 10 miles of cold, dark ocean separated them from Normandy. 10 miles and then hell. The landing craft were small, cramped vessels of steel, filling now with nervous men. Medics checked their equipment one final time. Aid bags, plasma, morphine syrettes, bandages, the tools of their trade, about to be tested as never before. Some medics prayed. Others tried to calm the increasingly seasick infantry around them. The channel was rough, waves slapping against the landing craft, filling the air with spray and the boats with seawater and vomit. As dawn broke, the massive naval bombardment began. Battleships and cruisers opened fire, hurling thousands of shells at the German defenses. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar that shook the very air. Bombers passed overhead, their engines adding to the cacophony. To the young men in the landing craft, many experiencing combat for the first time, it seemed impossible that anything could survive such firepower. Surely the beach would be clear, the Germans pulverized into submission. They were wrong. The first landing craft hit Omaha Beach at 6:30 in the morning. The ramp dropped, and men poured out into waist-deep water that was already churning with bullets. Machine gun fire from concrete bunkers on the bluffs swept across the beach in overlapping fields. Artillery shells exploded among the landing craft. Mortar rounds added their shrapnel to the chaos. Men fell instantly, some killed outright, others wounded, still others simply overwhelmed and paralyzed by fear. Ray Lambert's boat came in with the first wave. The moment the ramp dropped, machine gun fire ripped through it. Men fell before they even reached the water. Lambert and the other survivors jumped into the surf and began wading toward shore. All around them, soldiers were hit. Bodies floated in the waves. The water was already turning red. Lambert began working immediately, as documented in his later accounts and those of fellow soldiers. A wounded soldier struggled in the water ahead of him. Lambert grabbed him, began dragging him toward shore while machine gun bullets kicked up water around them. He got the man to the beach, laid him behind what little shelter the low seawall provided, began assessing his injuries. Then another wounded man, then another. Military records credit him with rescuing and treating numerous casualties in that first chaotic hour, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire. Then he was hit. A bullet tore into his arm. According to Lambert's own testimony, he treated himself, injecting morphine, applying a quick bandage, and kept working. He couldn't stop. Everywhere he looked, men needed help. Soldiers with severed limbs, soldiers with their abdomens torn open, soldiers drowning in shallow water, too wounded to save themselves. He moved among them, the morphine dulling some of the pain in his arm, his training taking over, his hands working even as his mind struggled to process the carnage's scale. He was hit again. This time in the leg, a bullet that, as he later described, opened it to the bone. Lambert applied a tourniquet to himself, injected another morphine syringe, and tried to instruct another medic on continuing the work. But the noise was too great. He shouted instructions that couldn't be heard. Then that medic was killed, shot through the head, dead instantly. Lambert didn't stop. He went back into the water, pulling wounded men from the surf. That's when the most devastating blow came. A landing craft dropped its ramp directly on him. The impact crushed vertebrae in his spine and drove him underwater. Years later, Lambert would recall the weight, the struggle to push upward, to get his head above water. He could feel broken vertebrae grinding with every movement. Yet somehow he grabbed another wounded soldier and dragged him toward shore. Finally, Lambert collapsed. He was loaded onto an evacuation craft and sent to England. Of the 31 men who had landed with him that morning, only 7 survived the day, a casualty rate of over 77%. Lambert had been wounded at least 3 times, possibly 4. He would spend months in hospitals recovering and would later receive the Bronze Star and another Purple Heart to add to his earlier decorations from North Africa and Sicily. Ray Lambert's experience, though particularly dramatic, was far from unique. All along Omaha Beach, medics were performing similar acts of valor. They worked under fire, exposed and vulnerable, doing their desperate best to save lives amid unimaginable chaos. Captain Robert Ralston led Company A's medical section. Their landing craft hit a mine and exploded before reaching shore. Ralston and his men found themselves in the water, equipment lost, some wounded by the explosion itself. They made it to shore, regrouped what they could, and began treating casualties. When the company was forced to withdraw under heavy fire, Ralston and his surviving medics stayed behind with the wounded, continuing to work even as German artillery fell around them. Later, they attempted a second assault, coming in again through heavy fire. Of the 90 men in Ralston's company who landed that morning, only 12 survived to report to the regimental aid station that evening. Within 30 minutes of the first wave landing, medics had established the first aid stations on the beach itself, nothing more than slight depressions in the sand that offered minimal protection from machine gun fire, but at least provided a place to gather and treat the wounded. 4 aid stations were operating within 90 minutes, though operating might be too generous a word. They were desperately trying to keep up with the flood of casualties, working with whatever supplies had made it to shore, constantly exposed to enemy fire. The medics' supplies had been carefully prepared for the invasion. Waterproofed medical kits, packed into waxed mortar shell cases, were supposed to provide protection during the beach landing. Many of these were lost when landing craft sank, or fell overboard when wounded men stumbled and dropped them. Other supplies were deliberately left behind as men fled the killing zone, choosing survival over equipment. Medics improvised, sharing supplies, scrounging from the aid bags of dead medics, making do with whatever they could find. The scale of the casualties was overwhelming. In some sectors, particularly on Omaha Beach, casualty rates approached 40% in the first waves. Men were wounded faster than medics could treat them. The basic protocols, stop bleeding, treat shock, evacuate, broke down in the face of such numbers. Medics had to perform brutal triage, deciding who could be saved and who was beyond help. A soldier with an abdominal wound and pale, clammy skin, already showing signs of profound shock, might have to be passed over in favor of a soldier with a simple extremity wound that could be quickly bandaged. The first soldier might die while the medic worked on the second, but the second had a chance of survival, and medics had to make those impossible calculations dozens of times that first morning. Morphine flowed freely. Soldiers in agony received syrettes, sometimes multiple doses. The medics worked through their supplies with alarming speed. Some ran out of morphine within the first hour and had to make do with reassurance and quick bandaging. Others, more fortunate or more conservative, made their morphine last through the day, but only by withholding it from soldiers who probably needed it. Plasma administration proved nearly impossible in the early hours. Establishing an IV line required relative calm, clean water, a few minutes of focused work. None of these were available on Omaha Beach that morning. Plasma had to wait until casualties were evacuated to ships or to aid stations further inland, where medics had time and protection enough to actually use it. The wounded were supposed to be evacuated from the beach to landing craft that would ferry them to hospital ships offshore. This system, carefully planned in the weeks before the invasion, collapsed almost immediately. Landing craft bringing in reinforcements couldn't afford to hang around on the beach to collect wounded. They dropped their troops and retreated as quickly as possible. The wounded piled up, taking what shelter they could find, waiting for evacuation that was hours delayed. Some wounded drowned. High tide came in, and men too injured to move found themselves in water again. Medics tried to drag casualties higher up the beach, but there were too many, and the medics were exhausted, often wounded themselves. Some soldiers, unable to move and unable to call for help over the noise, simply slipped below the water and were gone. As the day progressed and American forces finally broke through the German defenses, the immediate crisis eased somewhat. More medical supplies came ashore. Aid stations moved off the beach into slightly more protected positions. The evacuation system began to function, but the work continued relentlessly. The 16th Infantry Regiment alone suffered over 1,000 casualties on D-Day. Every one of those soldiers who survived long enough to be evacuated did so in part because a medic had reached him, treated him, kept him alive. The landing at Utah Beach, though less costly in casualties, still demanded everything from its medics. Airborne units, dropped inland hours before the beach landings, faced their own medical nightmares that reveal another dimension of the medic's experience. Paratroopers were scattered across the Norman countryside, often landing miles from their intended drop zones in flooded fields or dense hedgerows. Medics carrying only the small parachutist first aid kit with its limited supplies treated wounded wherever they found. Them, often working alone or in pairs, cut off from resupply and support. The relationships that formed between medics and the soldiers they served were unlike anything else in military life. Infantry learned to trust their medics completely. Their lives might literally depend on that trust. A soldier hit in the chest needed to know his medic would come, would reach him somehow, would do everything humanly possible to keep him alive. That trust had to be earned, rebuilt after every time a medic had to make the impossible choice to leave one casualty to save another. For medics, this trust created its own burden. They knew every soldier in their unit personally, knew who had a wife waiting at home, who had just become a father, who was planning to propose after the war. When one of those men fell wounded, it wasn't an anonymous casualty. It was Joe, who'd shown the medic pictures of his baby daughter. It was Frank, who'd shared his chocolate ration when the medic had been too tired to eat. It was Mike, who'd promised to teach the medic to fish when they all got back home. This personal connection made saving lives more meaningful, but losing them more devastating. An infantry rifleman might never learn the name of the enemy soldier he killed. A medic always knew the names of the men he couldn't save. Those names haunted them. Decades later, elderly medics could still recite the names of soldiers who'd died in their arms, could still see their faces, could still hear their final words. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the bocage, created a different kind of medical challenge than the beach landings had. Ancient earthen walls topped with thick hedges divided fields into small compartments, each a potential fortress. Advancing meant crossing open ground under fire, then fighting through the hedgerows themselves. The fighting was close, personal, and constant. Casualties didn't come in massive waves as they had on D-Day, but they came steadily, day after day, week after week. Medics learned to move with their units through this terrain, staying close but not so close that they'd be caught in the initial burst of fire that met each advance. When men fell, medics would watch for a lull in the firing, then dash out to reach the wounded. Sometimes there was no lull. They went anyway, because that's what the job required. The wounded couldn't wait for perfect conditions. The evacuation of casualties through hedgerow country proved particularly difficult, adding another layer of challenge that official planning had underestimated. Wheeled litters couldn't navigate the narrow paths and thick vegetation. Every casualty had to be carried on a stretcher by hand, typically requiring 4 men for each wounded soldier. This back-breaking work had to be done while staying low to avoid sniper fire, while navigating through mud and over obstacles, while enemy artillery could land at any moment. The distances weren't far, maybe a few hundred yards from the front line to the battalion aid station. But those few hundred yards could take an hour or more of exhausting physical labor. Stretcher bearers worked in rotation because the work was so demanding, but there were never enough of them. Often, the medic who'd treated a casualty would help carry him back, then return to the front to treat the next one. Some medics made that journey dozens of times in a single day. Aid stations had to be positioned carefully, close enough to the front that casualties didn't have too far to travel, but protected enough that medical personnel could actually work. Medics set up in farmhouses when they could find them standing, in stone buildings, in any structure that offered walls and a roof. When no suitable building existed, they worked in the open, maybe in a slight depression that offered minimal protection from enemy observation, maybe behind a hedgerow, maybe with nothing but camouflage netting to hide them from German aircraft. These aid stations became small islands of medical capability where more extensive treatment could be provided than was possible at the point of injury. Here, medics had time, minutes anyway, if not hours, to thoroughly assess casualties. They could administer plasma more carefully, clean and dress wounds properly, stabilize fractures, provide morphine, and monitor its effects. They could sort casualties for further evacuation, deciding who needed immediate surgical intervention and who could wait. But even in aid stations, safety was relative. German artillery didn't distinguish between combat units and medical facilities. Shells fell randomly, and sometimes an aid station that had seemed well protected would take a direct hit. The Red Cross flags that marked these locations were supposed to provide protection under the Geneva Conventions, but artillery gunners miles away couldn't see flags, and even if they could, not all of them cared. Two medics of the 101st Airborne, Kenneth Moore and Robert Wright, found themselves near the village of Angeville-au-Plain, just inland from Utah Beach. They took over a small church, converting it into an aid station. For 3 days, as battle raged around them, they treated wounded from both sides. Americans, Germans, even injured French civilians. At one point, they had 80 patients in the small church. German soldiers came through multiple times, sometimes briefly occupying the village, but left the church and its medics unmolested. Moore and Wright refused to be evacuated, staying with their wounded even when American troops withdrew from the area. They saved dozens of lives through sheer determination and skill, treating injuries far beyond what 2 medics with limited supplies should have been able to handle. As American forces moved inland from the beaches, the nature of the fighting changed, but the demands on medics remained intense. The Norman hedgerow country, bocage in French, was a defender's paradise. Ancient hedgerows, thick, walls of earth and vegetation, divided fields into small compartments. Each hedgerow could conceal German troops, machine guns, snipers. Advancing meant crossing open fields under fire, then fighting through the hedgerows themselves. Casualties were constant. Medics learned to move with their units, staying close but not so close that they'd be caught in the initial burst of fire that met each advance. When men fell, medics would wait for a lull in the firing, then dart out to reach the wounded. Sometimes there was no lull. They went anyway. The hedgerows made evacuation particularly difficult. Wheeled litters couldn't navigate the narrow paths and thick vegetation. Wounded had to be carried on stretchers, back-breaking work that required multiple men for each casualty. Aid stations had to be close to the front, but protected enough to actually function. Medics set up in farmhouses, in bocage corners, in any spot that offered some shelter. They worked in the open when they had to. As the campaign ground on through June and July, medical supply lines improved. Fresh morphine, new bandages, more plasma arrived regularly. But the casualties never stopped. Companies that landed on D-Day with full strength were down to half that by the end of June. Every one of those casualties passed through medics' hands first. The psychological toll on medical personnel was immense. They saw the worst injuries, spent the most time with dying men, had to make the hardest choices. An infantry rifleman might shoot at enemies he never clearly saw, might be in combat for only minutes at a time before getting back to cover. A medic was exposed continuously, kneeling in the open while treating wounded, then exposed again while evacuating them. And unlike infantry, who could steel themselves by dehumanizing the enemy, medics had to remain human, had to care deeply about every casualty, because that care was what kept them going. Some medics broke. They couldn't take the constant death, the impossible decisions, the parade of broken bodies. They developed what was then called combat exhaustion, or battle fatigue, what we now recognize as acute stress reaction. They would freeze up, unable to function, or would have to be evacuated themselves for psychological treatment. But most kept going. They adapted, hardened, developed the psychological armor necessary to function in that environment. They learned to focus on the medical task rather than the person, at least in the moment. Emotions could be processed later. in whatever quiet minutes they could find. During the crisis, there was only the work. Stop the bleeding, stabilize the patient, move to the next one. By the end of August 1944, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. The 16th Infantry Regiment and its medics had been in continuous combat for nearly 3 months. They had treated thousands of casualties, used thousands of bandages and morphine syrettes, administered thousands of units of plasma. They had saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. They had also lost some of their own. Medics died on Omaha Beach. They died in the bocage. They died from artillery fire, from snipers, from mines. The Red Cross armband hadn't protected them. Nothing had. But they had kept going, because wounded men needed them, because that was their job, because there was literally no one else to do it. The Normandy campaign established patterns that would hold for the rest of the war in Europe. Medics at the very front, providing immediate treatment under fire. Battalion aid stations slightly back, where more extensive care could be given. Evacuation to regimental aid stations, then to field hospitals and evacuation hospitals. The system worked, mostly, when it could. And when it couldn't, when circumstances broke down all the carefully laid plans, medics improvised and kept their soldiers alive through sheer, stubborn determination. But Europe was only one theater of the war. On the other side of the world, in jungles and on islands, medics faced a completely different set of challenges. The Pacific War had its own horrors, its own unique demands. In the next section, we'll journey to that distant theater, where medics fought not just the Japanese, but also tropical diseases, brutal terrain, and conditions that made the bocage country of Normandy seem almost civilized by comparison. A different hell. The Pacific Theater. The jungle dripped. That's what struck medics arriving in the Pacific Theater first. The constant moisture. Rain fell in sheets that could last for hours or days. When it wasn't raining, humidity hung in the air like a physical presence, making every breath feel labored, making every surface slick and rotting. Water pooled in every depression, turned paths to mud, created breeding grounds for mosquitoes that swarmed in clouds so thick they could choke a man. This was a different war from Europe. Here, medics faced an enemy who viewed capture as dishonor and fighting to the death as sacred duty. They faced terrain that could kill as readily as any bullet, jungle so dense a man could be 3 feet from another and never know it. Coral atolls with no shelter from sun or shell fire, mountainous islands where every step was a climb. And they faced diseases that Europe had largely left behind in earlier centuries. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, scrub typhus, and the ubiquitous jungle rot that ate away at skin and equipment alike. The island-hopping campaign that defined American strategy in the Pacific created unique medical challenges. Each invasion began with an amphibious assault, similar in some ways to the European landings, but often more brutal. Islands like Tarawa and Peleliu had no real beaches, just coral reefs that forced landing craft to stop hundreds of yards offshore. Marines and army troops had to wade through chest-deep water under fire, making them perfect targets. Medics waded with them, their aid, bags held overhead, trying desperately to keep their medical supplies dry. On Tarawa in November 1943, the first waves took catastrophic casualties. The small atoll, barely 2 miles long, was defended by nearly 5,000 Japanese troops dug into concrete bunkers and fortified positions. Naval bombardment had failed to destroy these defenses, and when Marines landed, they met withering fire. In the first hours, casualties approached 30%. Medics trying to establish aid stations on the beach found there was no beach, just a seawall that offered minimal cover while Japanese machine guns swept everything beyond it. Navy corpsmen, the medics of the Marine Corps, moved among the wounded under fire so intense that most observers thought it impossible anyone could survive. Yet they worked, dragging casualties to whatever shelter existed, applying bandages while bullets kicked up sand around them, administering morphine to men in shock. The evacuation system broke down almost immediately. There were simply too many wounded and too few corpsmen still standing. One particular challenge in the Pacific was that Japanese forces often targeted medics deliberately. Unlike in Europe, where German soldiers generally, though not always, respected the Geneva Conventions, Japanese troops viewed such considerations as weakness. They learned to recognize medics by their behavior, men who ran into the open to help fallen soldiers, and specifically targeted them. This forced many medics to remove their Red Cross markings entirely, hoping to blend in with regular troops. But this created its own problems, as wounded men looking desperately for help couldn't identify their medics in the confusion of battle. The terrain itself was unlike anything medics had trained for. Dense jungle vegetation meant visibility of only a few feet. Evacuating wounded required cutting paths through undergrowth, carrying casualties over terrain that could barely support an unburdened man. Steep ravines, swift-running rivers, mountains that seemed to go straight up. All of this had to be crossed while carrying wounded on stretchers. In New Guinea, where fighting dragged on for years, medics dealt with conditions that seemed almost medieval. The jungle was so thick that entire battalions could become disoriented within yards of a cleared trail. The heat was crushing, temperatures soaring into the high 90s with humidity to match. Men sweated constantly, becoming dehydrated despite drinking as much water as they could find. Fungal infections flourished in this environment. Jungle rot became so common it was almost expected. The skin between toes, underarms, in the groin, anywhere moisture collected, would break down, developing painful lesions that oozed and bled. Malaria was perhaps the single greatest medical challenge in the Pacific. In some units, malaria casualties outnumbered combat casualties. The disease, transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes, caused high fever, chills, severe fatigue, and could be deadly if untreated. Medics distributed daily doses of atabrine, a synthetic anti-malarial drug that had largely replaced quinine by mid-war. The yellow tablets turned soldiers' skin a slight yellow tinge, but they reduced malaria rates significantly. Still, compliance was a constant battle. Soldiers hated the side effects and would try to avoid taking their daily dose. Medics had to watch men swallow the tablets to ensure they actually took them. Dengue fever, another mosquito-borne disease, caused excruciating joint pain. So severe it earned the nickname breakbone fever. There was no treatment beyond rest and pain relief, which were in short supply on the front lines. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water or food, could rapidly dehydrate a soldier and leave him unable to fight. Medics emphasized field sanitation, but in jungle conditions where clean water was scarce and facilities were non-existent, outbreaks were common. The portable surgical hospitals introduced in the Pacific represented an innovation born of necessity. These small units, each with 3 surgeons and about 25 enlisted men, could be packed up and moved relatively quickly. They set up close to the front, often within earshot of combat, and performed emergency surgery that could mean the difference between life and death for severely wounded soldiers. The Battle of Buna in late 1942 and early 1943 showcased both the promise and limitations of these portable hospitals. The 11th Portable Surgical Hospital operated in jungle conditions under near constant threat. Their tents were camouflaged but still visible from the air, and Japanese aircraft occasionally strafed them despite the Red Cross markings. Supplies were chronically short. At times, they were performing surgery with instruments they'd only just sterilized. on tables made from packing crates, with no electricity beyond small generators that barely provided enough light. Yet they saved lives. During a 10-day period in June 1944, the 11th Portable processed 102 patients and performed 87 operations with only one death, a remarkable achievement given the conditions. Surgeons worked in rotation, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, for days at a stretch. When casualties flooded in, there were no breaks. They operated continuously for 72 hours, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, knowing that every delay meant another soldier might die. The heat complicated every medical procedure. Blood plasma, which needed to be kept cool, would warm to body temperature within minutes in the jungle heat. Equipment deteriorated rapidly. Metal rusted overnight. Canvas rotted. Drugs broke down faster than their labeled expiration dates would suggest. Medics learned to requisition supplies constantly, hoarding when they could, improvising when they couldn't. Tropical diseases affected medics themselves, a fact that military planners had underestimated. They weren't immune to malaria or dengue or dysentery. A sick medic meant one less person to treat casualties, and medical personnel were already stretched critically thin. Some medics continued working even when feverish and exhausted, dosing themselves with atabrine and morphine and whatever else they needed to keep functioning. But here's what post-war medical analysis revealed. In some Pacific campaigns, medics' disease casualties exceeded their combat casualties. The 11th Portable Surgical Hospital's records, for instance, show that during their time in New Guinea, more medical personnel were temporarily incapacitated by malaria than by Japanese action. This created an unexpected problem. Who treats the medics? The solution, improvised in the field, was that medics treated each other, often while still sick themselves. A medic with malaria would administer plasma to a wounded soldier in the morning, receive his own malaria treatment from another sick medic in the afternoon, then return to treating casualties that evening. The official medical doctrine called this continuity of care. The medics called it survival. The island-hopping campaign meant that medical units had to establish themselves rapidly after each invasion, then pack up and move to the next island weeks or months later. The 11th Portable Surgical Hospital, for instance, moved from New Guinea to Leyte in the Philippines, then to Luzon, following the advancing American forces. Each move meant the same challenges: finding suitable ground, setting up tents, establishing supply lines, treating casualties even while still organizing. Iwo Jima presented its own nightmare. The small volcanic island was one of the most heavily defended places on Earth. Japanese forces had dug into an elaborate network of caves and tunnels. When Marines landed in February 1945, they met fire from positions they couldn't even see. The black volcanic sand provided no cover, and casualties mounted rapidly. Navy corpsmen landed with the first waves, and many were hit within minutes. The beach became a killing ground. Wounded Marines lay exposed, and corpsmen who tried to reach them were cut down. Those who survived the first hours set up aid stations literally on the beach, the only available space, where they worked while mortar rounds and artillery shells fell around them. The volcanic rock made digging foxholes nearly impossible. Aid stations had no protection beyond sandbags that had to be filled with the black sand, which was so fine it barely stayed in the bags. Corpsmen worked in the open, totally exposed, knowing they could be hit at any moment. They treated burns from flame weapons that Japanese defenders used extensively. They treated the horrific wounds caused by mines and artillery. They used every morphine syringe they had, exhausted their supply of plasma, and kept working with bare hands and desperate improvisation when they ran out of everything else. On Okinawa, the last major battle of the Pacific War, the scale of casualties was staggering. The campaign lasted nearly 3 months, and medical personnel were in action for all of it. The terrain was rugged, with deep ravines and steep ridges. Rain turned everything to mud. Aid stations were set up wherever slight protection could be found, often just a drainage ditch or a fold in the ground. This was where Desmond Doss performed the actions that would earn him the Medal of Honor. But his story deserves its own telling, which we'll get to shortly. For now, it's enough to say that on Okinawa, as across the Pacific, medics proved that courage doesn't require weapons, that compassion can coexist with the worst brutality of war, and that saving life in the midst of organized death is perhaps the most fundamentally human act possible. The psychological toll in the Pacific was, if anything, worse than in Europe. The jungle's isolation, the disease, the particularly brutal nature of the fighting, the knowledge that capture meant torture and death, all of this wore on medical personnel. They saw Marines and soldiers killed in ways that defied comprehension, incinerated by flame weapons, dismembered by mines, simply disappearing in the jungle never to be found. They treated casualties who had been wounded days earlier, festering in the jungle heat, infected wounds swarming with flies and maggots. And they saw Japanese casualties. Occasionally, wounded Japanese soldiers would be brought to American aid stations. Medics were supposed to treat all casualties according to the Geneva Conventions, but this was complicated. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated to view capture as shameful, and wounded Japanese prisoners sometimes tried to kill themselves or to take American medical personnel with them. Some had grenades concealed on their bodies, activating them when medics approached. This led to a grim practice of thoroughly searching and restraining Japanese casualties before treating them, a procedure that probably violated the spirit, if not the letter of the conventions, but that seemed necessary for survival. Despite everything, medics in the Pacific saved lives at a remarkable rate. The survival rate for soldiers who reached medical care exceeded anything seen in previous wars. This was due in part to medical advances, the availability of plasma and sulfur drugs, the forward deployment of surgical capability. But equally important was the courage and competence of medics themselves. They adapted to impossible conditions, improvised solutions to problems they'd never been trained to solve, and simply refused to give up on the wounded in their care. As the war drew toward its end in August 1945, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's subsequent surrender, medical personnel in the Pacific could finally stop. For years, they'd been in constant action, fighting disease and wounds and despair. The sudden peace must have felt surreal, a gift too large to fully comprehend. But the war had left its mark. Many medics came, home with malaria that would recur for years, their bodies harboring parasites that drugs could suppress but not eliminate. They carried memories of treating casualties in steaming jungles, of amputating limbs with bone saws in tents lit by oil lamps, of zipping body bags around men they'd known. The Pacific Theater had demanded everything from its medics, and they had given it: their health, their sanity, sometimes their lives. Yet through it all, they had maintained their humanity. They had treated enemy casualties when they could do so safely. They had saved their own men and often felt the weight of those they couldn't save. And they had proved beyond any doubt that medical personnel belong at the very front of battle, that the immediate treatment they provide is not a luxury but an essential element of survival. Now let's turn to one particular medic whose story exemplifies the courage of unarmed men in combat. Desmond Doss, the conscientious objector who became a hero. Conscience and courage. Desmond Doss and extraordinary valor. Some men went to war driven by patriotism, others by duty, still others by the simple fact that they'd been drafted and had no choice. Desmond Thomas Doss went because he felt called to serve, yet his beliefs prohibited him from ever carrying a weapon. This created a tension that would define his military service and ultimately lead to one of the war's most remarkable stories of courage. Doss was born in 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia, to a family of devout Seventh-day Adventists. His childhood was shaped by strict adherence to the Ten Commandments, particularly "Thou shalt not kill." A framed poster of the commandments hung in the family home, and young Desmond studied it constantly. The sixth commandment, illustrated with an image of Cain killing Abel, made a profound impression. Violence, in Doss's understanding, was fundamentally wrong. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Doss was working at the Newport News shipyard, a defense industry job that exempted him from the draft. He could have stayed there in safety for the entire war. Instead, he felt compelled to serve his country. But how could he reconcile service with his religious convictions against killing? The answer came in the form of the medical corps. As a combat medic, he could serve on the front lines, face the same dangers as his comrades, and yet remain true to his faith by saving lives rather than taking them. Basic training was brutal for Doss, and the records from his unit reveal the intensity of what he faced. His refusal to carry a weapon or to train on Saturdays, his Sabbath, marked him as fundamentally different. According to testimonies collected years later, fellow soldiers called him a coward, questioned his manhood, subjected him to harassment that crossed into physical intimidation. Officers attempted to have him discharged, claiming he was unfit for service. At one point, his company commander tried to initiate court-martial proceedings. The pressure to quit was immense and officially documented. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Doss refused to break. He endured the harassment, the mockery, the isolation. He completed all physical training, proved himself as fit and capable as anyone in his unit. And slowly, this part comes from fellow soldiers' accounts recorded much later, something shifted. They might not have understood his beliefs, but they couldn't deny his commitment or his courage in standing by his convictions despite enormous pressure to conform. What no one in his unit could have predicted was how completely Doss would transform their opinions once actual combat began. Doss shipped out to the Pacific with the 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. His first combat came in Guam in July 1944, and it was there that his fellow soldiers' opinions truly began to change. Under heavy fire, Doss repeatedly exposed himself to danger to treat wounded men. He moved through machine gun fire to reach casualties, dragged them to safety, administered morphine and plasma, while bullets whipped past. For his actions on Guam, he received the Bronze Star. Similar valor in the Philippines earned him a second Bronze Star. By now, the men of Company B had come to trust their unusual medic. They knew that if they fell, Doss would come for them, regardless of the danger. His refusal to carry a weapon no longer seemed like cowardice. It seemed like something else entirely, a different kind of courage, perhaps even more difficult than the courage required to fight. The test that would make Doss famous came in April and May 1945 on Okinawa. The 77th Division was ordered to capture a plateau called the Maeda Escarpment by American forces, or Hacksaw Ridge by the locals, a sheer cliff about 400 feet high that dominated the surrounding terrain. Japanese forces had spent years turning this natural fortress into a maze of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions. Taking it would require climbing cargo nets up the cliff face while under fire from hidden defenders. Company B made the ascent on May 2nd, 1945. Doss climbed with them, unarmed as always, carrying his medical supplies. At the top, they found a hellscape. Japanese machine guns were positioned to sweep the entire plateau. Mortars and artillery fell constantly. As American soldiers advanced, they were cut down in waves. Doss went to work. While other soldiers fired back or sought cover, he moved through the killing field, looking for wounded. He found them everywhere, men with limbs blown off, men with their abdomens torn open, men dying and men already dead. He began treating them, working frantically, ignoring his own safety completely. What made Doss's actions even more remarkable was that he had deliberately removed all markings identifying him as a medic. Experience had taught that Japanese forces targeted medics, and a Red Cross armband was essentially a bullseye. So Doss wore no distinctive markings, appeared to be just another infantryman, except that he carried no weapon and was constantly exposing himself to treat the wounded. The fighting continued for days. Company B was ordered to retreat on May 5. But Doss refused to leave. An estimated 75 to 100 wounded men remained on the plateau, too injured to evacuate themselves. If they were left behind, they would die, either from their wounds or when Japanese forces overran the position. So Doss stayed. Alone on a plateau controlled by the enemy, he began the painstaking work of lowering casualties off the cliff. He would drag or carry a wounded man to the edge, fashion a rope sling around him, and lower him down the cliff face to waiting medics below. Then he'd go back for another, and another. All while Japanese forces were still on the plateau, while bullets and shrapnel flew, while common sense screamed at him to save himself. He saved them all. 75 men by the official count, possibly more. One by one he lowered them to safety, spending hours doing work that should have been impossible for one man. Witnesses later reported that Doss kept repeating a prayer. "Lord, please help me get one more. One more soldier saved, one more life preserved. Just one more, and then one more after that." Miraculously, Doss emerged uninjured from Hacksaw Ridge, but his valor wasn't finished. On May 21st, during a night attack, he was caught in an enemy artillery barrage. A grenade exploded near him, sending shrapnel tearing into his legs. Doss treated his own wounds, applied bandages, injected himself with morphine. When litter bearers came to evacuate him, he insisted they take a more seriously wounded soldier first. While waiting for their return, Doss saw another soldier get hit. Despite his own injuries, he crawled to the man and began treating him. Then a Japanese sniper shot Doss through the arm, shattering the bone. In incredible pain, Doss made a splint from a rifle stock and tied his mangled arm to it. He crawled 300 yards to the aid station, refusing to call for help because he didn't want to endanger anyone else. This was Desmond Doss, a man who had been mocked as a coward, who had endured harassment and abuse, who had nearly been drummed out of the service, proving beyond any possible doubt that courage comes in many forms. His actions on Hacksaw Ridge earned him the Medal of Honor, presented by President Harry Truman on October 12, 1945. Doss became the first conscientious objector to receive America's highest military decoration. But Doss's story, remarkable as it is, was far from unique in demonstrating the courage of combat medics. Throughout the war, medics repeatedly displayed extraordinary valor. The nature of their work demanded it. They had to expose themselves to danger to reach the wounded, had to remain calm while under fire, had to continue functioning when every instinct screamed for them to take cover. The Medal of Honor roles include other medics whose actions seem almost superhuman. Private First Class David B. Bleak, serving in Korea just a few years after World War II, killed 2 enemy soldiers with his bare hands to protect wounded men he was treating, then continued to care for casualties while wounded himself. This followed the example set by World War II medics who, though officially non-combatants, would sometimes fight when necessary to protect their patients. Countless other medics performed acts that, had they been witnessed by the right people at the right time, might have earned similar recognition. The medic who ran through machine gun fire to reach a wounded soldier worked on him for an hour while exposed to constant danger. and somehow got him to safety alive. The corpsman who swam through surf to rescue drowning Marines, pulling them ashore one by one while enemy artillery fell around him. The medic who stayed behind with wounded during a retreat was captured by German forces, but was released when they recognized his dedication to treating all casualties, regardless of nationality. The reality was that extraordinary valor was common among medics. Almost every day, in almost every engagement, some medic somewhere was doing something that in a sane world would be considered impossible. They did it because wounded men needed them. They did it because they'd been trained to do it, and training had become instinct. And they did it because, despite everything, despite the horror and the death and the exhaustion, they still believed that saving a life mattered. Not all heroes survived to receive recognition. Many medics died performing acts of extraordinary courage, killed while treating wounded, shot while exposed in the open, blown apart by artillery while trying to establish aid stations. Their names might not be remembered, might not appear on any honor roll, but they died doing the most fundamentally good thing a human can do, trying to preserve another life at risk to their own. The legacy of medics like Desmond Doss extends far beyond their individual actions. They proved that the combat medic role, controversial at the beginning of the war, was absolutely essential. They demonstrated that unarmed soldiers could display courage equal to or exceeding that of armed troops. And they showed that even in the midst of history's most destructive war, in an environment designed specifically to kill, the human impulse toward healing and preservation could not only survive, but could triumph. Their courage inspired those around them. Soldiers fought harder knowing their medic would come for them if they fell. Units bonded more tightly, knowing they had someone dedicated to their survival. And medics themselves drew strength from each other, from the knowledge that across the world, other medics were facing similar challenges and refusing to give up. But valor, crucial as it was, came at a cost. The next section examines that cost, the psychological and emotional toll of combat medicine, the weight that medics carried long after the physical wounds had healed, the weight of war. Psychological toll and lasting trauma. There's a photograph from late 1944 that captures something essential about the medic's experience. It shows a young man, probably no more than 20, sitting on the ground outside a tent. His uniform is filthy, his helmet hangs loose on his head, but it's his eyes that draw attention. They're looking at nothing, staring past the camera, past the present moment entirely. This is the 1,000-yard stare, the visible manifestation of a mind that has seen too much and can no longer process what it's seeing. Combat took a psychological toll on everyone who experienced it. But for medics, the toll was unique. While infantrymen could distance themselves emotionally from the enemy, reducing opponents to targets to be eliminated, medics had to remain empathetic. Their entire function depended on caring deeply about each wounded soldier. They couldn't allow themselves the psychological protection of emotional numbing, because if they stopped caring, they stopped being effective medics. This created an impossible situation. On one hand, medics needed to maintain emotional connection to treat casualties with the compassion and dedication the work required. On the other hand, those same emotions made them vulnerable to psychological trauma. Every soldier they couldn't save, every decision to move on from a dying man to help one more salvageable, every moment of witnessing human suffering, all of this accumulated in their psyches with no healthy outlet. In World War II, the military didn't fully understand combat stress. Terms like shell shock from World War I had fallen out of favor, deemed too sympathetic to what many officers still viewed as cowardice or weakness. The new terminology was combat exhaustion, or battle fatigue, which at least acknowledged that something was happening to soldiers beyond simple failure of will. But treatment remained primitive, and the stigma was enormous. Medics were particularly susceptible. Studies done after the war suggested that medical personnel had higher rates of combat stress reactions than regular infantry. This made sense when you understood their circumstances. They were constantly exposed to danger but couldn't fight back. They witnessed the most horrific injuries and had to maintain composure while treating them. They made life and death decisions repeatedly, knowing that choosing to help one casualty meant potentially abandoning another. And they formed close bonds with the soldiers in their units, then had to watch those same soldiers die despite their best efforts. The symptoms varied. Some medics developed what we'd now recognize as acute stress reactions: inability to function, trembling, hyperventilation, temporary paralysis. They'd freeze in combat, unable to perform even basic tasks. For some, this was temporary, lasting only hours or days. Others never recovered their effectiveness and had to be evacuated from combat for psychiatric treatment. More common were the slower developing symptoms. Nightmares plagued many medics, often for years after the war. They'd dream of the wounded men they'd treated, of the ones they'd lost, of blood and screaming, and the desperate fear in a dying soldier's eyes. Sleep became something to dread rather than seek, because sleep meant returning to the battlefield in dreams. Anxiety was pervasive, the hypervigilance required in combat, constantly scanning for threats, always alert to the sound of incoming fire, didn't shut off when danger passed. Former medics found themselves unable to relax even years later. Loud noises made them jump. Crowds made them nervous. They couldn't stand to have people behind them where they couldn't see. Their bodies remained primed for threats that no longer existed. Depression struck many. The weight of what they'd experienced, the loss of so many soldiers despite their best efforts, the knowledge that they'd had to make choices that resulted in some men dying, all of this could lead to profound sadness and loss of meaning. Some medics felt guilty for having survived when so many others hadn't. Others felt they'd failed, that if they'd been better, faster, more skilled, more soldiers would have lived. Moral injury was a concept that wouldn't be formally recognized for decades, but medics experienced it acutely. Making triage decisions, determining who would receive treatment and who was beyond help, violated their core commitment to saving all lives. Even when those decisions were medically sound, even when treating one soldier meant leaving another to die, the act of making that choice left psychological scars. Medics would replay these decisions for the rest of their lives, wondering if they'd made the right call, haunted by the faces of men they'd deemed unsalvageable. The isolation was particularly hard. When medics returned home, they found that civilians couldn't understand their experiences. How could they explain what it was like to kneel in mud and blood, working on a soldier whose legs had been blown off, while machine gun fire kicked up dirt around them? How could they convey the exhaustion of working for 3 days straight without sleep, treating one casualty after another in an endless stream? Most didn't even try. They kept their experiences locked inside, told their families that the war was over, and they didn't want to talk about it. This silence probably made things worse. Trauma that can't be shared, acknowledged, processed becomes toxic. It festers inside, creating distance between the traumatized person and everyone around them. Many medics struggled in relationships after the war, unable to connect emotionally, unable to explain why they sometimes seemed distant or angry or afraid for no apparent reason. Substance abuse became a coping mechanism for some. Alcohol could numb the memories, at least temporarily. It could quiet the nightmares, help them sleep, provide relief from the constant anxiety. Some medics who'd been teetotalers before the war became heavy drinkers afterward, self-medicating their psychological wounds with the only tool available. The military's treatment approaches for combat stress were well-intentioned but often inadequate. The PIE principles, proximity, immediacy, expectancy, dictated that affected soldiers should be treated close to the front, proximity, as soon as symptoms appeared, immediacy, with the expectation that they'd return to duty, expectancy. This actually worked reasonably well for acute reactions. Soldiers who broke down were evacuated to aid stations just behind the lines, given 48 hours of rest with sedation, provided hot food and clean clothes, then sent back to their units. Many did return to duty and functioned effectively, but this approach did nothing for the deeper, longer-term trauma that would manifest years later. And it reinforced the idea that combat stress was temporary, something to be quickly overcome and not spoken of. The message was clear. Real soldiers didn't break down, and if you did, you got over it quickly and got back to work. Some medics never recovered. They spent decades after the war struggling with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Relationships collapsed. Careers were derailed. Some turned to alcohol or drugs. Others withdrew from society entirely. And suicide, though data from that era is incomplete, claimed many. Yet remarkably, most medics did eventually find ways to cope. They built new lives, formed families, found meaning beyond the war. Some went into medicine, channeling their wartime experience into peacetime healing. Others left medicine entirely, unable to stomach even the reminders of what they'd seen. But they survived, bore their wounds privately, and often refused to speak about their experiences until very late in life. In recent decades, as understanding of PTSD has grown, some World War II medics have finally received diagnoses and treatment for trauma they've carried for 50 or 60 or 70 years. Organizations dedicated to veteran mental health have reached out to this aging population, offering counseling and support groups where they can finally share their experiences with people who understand. For some, this late recognition brings relief. For others, it comes too late to undo decades of suffering. The psychological toll on medics wasn't unique to them, of course. All combat veterans carried trauma, but medics' trauma had its own character, shaped by the specific challenges of their role. They had to be simultaneously tough and tender, had to witness the worst injuries while remaining compassionate, had to make impossible choices while maintaining hope. This unique combination of requirements created a unique pattern of psychological injury. The war taught important lessons about combat stress and its treatment, lessons that would shape military psychiatry for generations. By the end of World War II, it was finally acknowledged that combat stress was a natural response to extreme conditions, not a sign of weak character. This represented a significant shift from earlier attitudes, though full acceptance would take decades more. Modern military medicine has built on these lessons. Today's combat medics receive training in recognizing combat stress, not just in others, but in themselves. They're taught that psychological injury is as real as physical injury, and that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. Whether this is sufficient remains debatable. Veteran suicide rates remain alarmingly high. But it's at least progress beyond the denial and stigma that characterized earlier eras. For the World War II medics themselves, their psychological wounds became part of who they were, shaped their lives as surely as any physical injury. They carried these wounds quietly, mostly, with the same stoicism they'd shown on the battlefield. They didn't ask for sympathy or special treatment. They'd done their job, saved who they could, and that would have to be enough. But those wounds were there, invisible but profound. A reminder that war damages everyone it touches, that there's no such thing as emerging from combat unscathed. The young men who became medics, who ran into fire unarmed to save their brothers, who witnessed horrors no human should have to see, They paid a price far beyond what was visible. They paid it willingly, mostly, because the job needed doing, and they were the ones who'd been chosen to do it. But the price was real, and many paid it for the rest of their lives. Now let's turn to a brighter aspect of the medics' legacy: the medical advances that came from their work. The innovations forged in the crucible of combat that would transform civilian medicine for generations to come. Medical miracles. Innovations born of necessity. World War II transformed medicine. The desperate need to save wounded soldiers, combined with massive government investment and unprecedented cooperation between researchers, clinicians, and industry, led to advances that would reshape healthcare for decades. Combat medics were both witnesses to and agents of this transformation, using new drugs and techniques even as they were being developed, providing feedback that drove further innovation. Perhaps no single medical advance from the war was more important than penicillin. Discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, but largely ignored for years, penicillin was just beginning to show promise as the war started. Its ability to kill bacteria without harming human tissue made it potentially revolutionary, but production was the challenge. In 1940, enough penicillin to treat one patient required weeks of painstaking work and filled a laboratory. The war changed everything. American pharmaceutical companies, prodded by the government, and the military scaled up production dramatically. By 1943, there was enough penicillin for military use. By 1944, production had increased so much that civilian use became possible. The numbers are staggering. In 1942, production was measured in millions of units. By 1945, production had reached 650 billion units per month. For medics in the field, penicillin was nothing short of miraculous. Before its availability, infection was one of the greatest killers of wounded soldiers. A wound that seemed survivable could turn septic in days, poisoning the blood, causing fever and delirium, leading to death despite all efforts. Even with sulfur drugs, which had helped but not eliminated the problem, infection remained a serious threat. Penicillin changed this calculus completely. Administered early enough, it prevented infection from taking hold. Given to soldiers with already infected wounds, it cleared infections that would previously have been fatal. Amputations, common in earlier wars when gangrenous limbs had to be removed to save lives, became much less frequent. Soldiers who would have died from wound infections in World War I survived in World War II, thanks largely to penicillin. The drug wasn't available to frontline medics initially. It was too scarce and required refrigeration. But as production increased and more stable formulations were developed, it moved closer to the front. By late in the war, some field hospitals had penicillin supplies, and the drug was being administered within hours of injury rather than days. This early intervention proved crucial in preventing infections before they could establish themselves. The impact extended beyond battlefield trauma. Penicillin treated pneumonia, meningitis, gonorrhea, and other bacterial infections that had previously been difficult or impossible to cure. For medics dealing with diseases that affected troops as much as combat did, penicillin was transformative. Pneumonia, which could decimate units operating in cold, wet conditions, became treatable. Gonorrhea and syphilis, which had sidelined thousands of soldiers in previous wars, could now be cured with short courses of antibiotics rather than ineffective and harmful treatments like mercury. The second great medical innovation was blood plasma and transfusion. The ability to replace lost blood had been known for decades, but practical application on a mass scale had been impossible. Blood had to be carefully typed and matched. It had to be kept refrigerated. It couldn't be stored for more than a few weeks. These constraints made battlefield transfusion nearly impossible. The development of dried plasma solved many of these problems. Plasma, the liquid component of blood without the red cells, didn't require typing. Anyone could receive plasma without risk of rejection, and when dried to a powder, it could be stored without refrigeration for months or years. When needed, it was simply mixed with sterile water and was ready to use. Charles Drew, an African-American surgeon and researcher, played a crucial role in developing large-scale blood banking and plasma processing. His work for the Blood for Britain program and later the American Red Cross established systems that would supply plasma to medics throughout the war. Mobile blood donation stations, bloodmobiles, collected blood from civilian donors. Processing facilities separated plasma, dried it, and packaged it for shipping. But here's what they didn't teach in the military medical manuals. The entire system Drew had created was marred by a racist policy he opposed. In April 1941, the American Red Cross announced it would segregate blood donations by race, following War Department guidance. The official reasoning, as stated in military documents, was that racial blood mixing was not biologically convincing but psychologically important in America. Drew, the African-American scientist whose innovations had made the entire blood program possible, resigned from his position with the National Blood Bank in protest, though he made no public statement at the time. The irony was devastating. The man who'd solved the technical problems of blood preservation and mass distribution couldn't solve the social problem that undermined the scientific achievement. Soldiers of all races would receive plasma from segregated blood supplies, a practice with no medical justification but deemed necessary for morale. This added a bitter note to every plasma transfusion medics administered. The life-saving fluid they were injecting had been sorted by the race of its donors, a detail that revealed how even in matters of life and death, prejudice found ways to persist. For medics, plasma meant they could treat shock effectively for the first time. A soldier who had lost significant blood volume would go into shock. His blood pressure would drop, his organs would begin failing, and he'd die even if bleeding had been stopped. Plasma restored blood volume, bought time for evacuation and definitive treatment. It couldn't replace the oxygen-carrying capacity of red blood cells, but it didn't need to. As long as a patient had some blood left, plasma could keep his circulatory system functional long enough to get him to surgery. Medics administered hundreds of thousands of plasma transfusions during the war. They learned to find veins in casualties whose blood pressure had dropped so low that veins had collapsed. They learned to prepare the plasma quickly, mixing it in advance when they knew casualties were coming. They learned to monitor patients for allergic reactions or other complications. And they learned that plasma, though not a magic cure, was the single most important tool they had for keeping critically wounded soldiers alive. As the war progressed, medical supply chains evolved to deliver fresh, whole blood to forward hospitals. This was more challenging than plasma. Blood had to be typed, stored cold, and used within weeks. But it was even more effective for casualties who'd lost large amounts of blood. Refrigerated trucks, air transport, and complex logistics made it possible to have fresh blood available at field hospitals, sometimes within hours of it being donated thousands of miles away. Surgical techniques also advanced dramatically. The forward deployment of surgical capability, with portable surgical hospitals and mobile surgical units operating close to the front, meant that seriously wounded soldiers could receive life-saving surgery much faster than in previous wars. This golden hour concept, the idea that survival chances dropped dramatically the longer surgery was delayed, became a guiding principle of battlefield medicine. Surgeons learned to embrace damage control surgery, focusing on stopping bleeding and preventing contamination rather than trying to provide definitive repair. A soldier with a torn liver might receive a quick operation to pack the wound and control bleeding, then be evacuated to a rear hospital for more extensive repair. This approach saved lives by getting critically wounded soldiers stabilized quickly rather than attempting complex procedures under primitive conditions. Debridement, the removal of dead and contaminated tissue from wounds, became standard practice, preventing infections before they could start. Surgeons learned that aggressive early debridement was more effective than conservative approaches that tried to preserve tissue. This led to better outcomes, fewer infections, and fewer amputations. Fracture management improved significantly. The Thomas splint, introduced in World War I but not widely used, became standard for femur fractures. This simple device, a padded ring that went around the thigh with metal supports extending down the leg, prevented the fractured femur from causing further damage to blood vessels and soft tissue. Casualties with femur fractures who'd received Thomas splints in the field had dramatically higher survival rates than those who'd been transported without proper splinting. Plastic surgery, still a relatively new field, advanced rapidly as surgeons dealt with the horrific facial injuries that modern warfare produced. Techniques for reconstructing destroyed faces, developed by necessity to help disfigured soldiers, would later be adapted for civilian reconstructive surgery. Skin grafting improved. Methods for treating burn injuries evolved. All of this knowledge, gained at the cost of tremendous suffering, became part of the permanent medical toolkit. The war also drove advances in emergency medicine, though that term wouldn't be commonly used for another generation. The triage systems developed for sorting casualties, the emphasis on rapid stabilization and evacuation, the acceptance that not everyone could be saved and that resources had to be focused where they'd do the most good. All of these concepts would later shape civilian emergency medicine. Medical equipment improved constantly based on battlefield feedback. Better bandages, more effective tourniquets, improved plasma administration sets, portable surgical instruments. All were refined through iterative development driven by actual use in combat. Medics weren't passive recipients of whatever equipment they were issued. Their feedback shaped what the next generation of medics would receive. The sheer scale of medical operations during the war was unprecedented. The US military alone treated over 14 million sick or injured personnel during the war years. This massive volume of cases provided data that researchers could analyze, leading to better understanding of wound healing, shock, infection, and countless other medical issues. Studies that would have taken decades in peacetime were compressed into a few years of intensive wartime research. But the statistics, comprehensive as they were, couldn't capture certain realities. The official reports never recorded what it felt like to run out of morphine, with 20 wounded men still screaming. They didn't document the medic's hands shaking so badly from exhaustion and stress that he could barely hold a syringe. The data couldn't measure the psychological weight of performing your 50th amputation of the week, knowing each removed limb represented a life irrevocably changed. Based on what surviving medics reported decades later, these unmeasured costs may have been as significant as any captured in official medical records. Survival rates tell the story of this medical revolution, though the numbers reveal something surprising. In World War I, battlefield mortality was devastating. Roughly 30% of wounded soldiers died even after receiving medical treatment. By World War II, that figure had improved dramatically. According to military medical records, approximately 69% of wounded American soldiers survived once they reached medical care, a figure that would climb even higher in subsequent conflicts. The improvement came from multiple factors: better training for medics, antibiotics, blood plasma, faster evacuation, more capable surgical care positioned closer to the front. But here's what the statistics don't capture. Every one of those survivors owed their life to decisions made in seconds by exhausted, terrified young men working under impossible conditions. A medic's choice to apply a tourniquet here instead of there. To give morphine to this casualty, but not that one. to spend 30 seconds more with one wounded soldier, which meant 30 seconds less for the next. The result was clear. Thousands of soldiers who would have died in an earlier era survived to return home, thanks to the advances in battlefield medicine and the medics who implemented them. But those medics carried the weight of every soldier they couldn't save, every impossible choice, every moment when they'd had to move on from a dying man to help someone more salvageable. The knowledge gained didn't stay on the battlefield. Civilian hospitals adopted many of the techniques developed for military use. The concept of emergency rooms, though they'd existed before, became standardized based partly on military field hospital models. Ambulance services improved. The use of antibiotics spread rapidly. Blood banks, which had been experimental before the war, became standard features of hospitals afterward. Medics themselves often took this knowledge into civilian life. Many who'd trained as medics during the war went on to careers in medicine, nursing, or other healthcare fields. They brought with them practical experience that couldn't be taught in any classroom. A doctor who'd done emergency surgery in a tent under artillery fire, a nurse who'd managed 50 patients with only basic supplies, a medic who'd treated everything from bullet wounds to tropical diseases. These people transformed civilian healthcare simply by being there, by bringing battlefield lessons to peacetime practice. The psychological insights gained from treating combat stress would eventually reshape civilian psychiatry, though this took decades. The recognition that trauma could cause lasting psychological damage, that support and treatment were necessary, that early intervention could prevent chronic problems. All of these ideas, developed through military experience, would eventually influence how civilian society understood and treated PTSD, regardless of its source. Vaccines and disease prevention also benefited from wartime research. The military's focus on keeping troops healthy in tropical environments led to better anti-malarial drugs, vaccines for typhus and other diseases, improved water purification methods. These advances, developed to keep soldiers fighting, saved countless civilian lives in the decades after the war. Yet for all these advances, for all the lives saved by new drugs and techniques, the fundamental reality of combat medicine remained. Young men, often unarmed, working in impossible conditions to save other young men who'd been catastrophically injured by weapons designed specifically to kill. Technology and medicine could improve survival rates, could reduce suffering, could give more soldiers a chance to return home. But they couldn't eliminate the need for someone to be there, on the battlefield, willing to risk everything to help a wounded soldier. That requirement remained constant, regardless of how good the medical care had become. In the next section, we'll follow medics through the war's end and into its aftermath. The final battles, the liberation of concentration camps, the return home, and the long shadow that combat medicine cast over the rest of their lives. The end and after, liberation, return, and legacy. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany in early 1945, combat medics encountered something that historical records suggest exceeded even their darkest expectations. They'd treated catastrophic battlefield injuries for years, but nothing in their training or experience prepared them for the concentration camps. The medics who entered Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and other camps faced a humanitarian crisis that, according to military medical reports, dwarfed anything they'd encountered on battlefields. Thousands of emaciated prisoners needed immediate attention. Many suffered from advanced starvation, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other diseases. Some had been beaten or tortured. Medical assessments documented that many prisoners were too weak to walk, to eat, even to speak coherently. Medical personnel mobilized every resource, but the scale overwhelmed their capabilities. Army medical guides would later document a cruel paradox. Feeding starving people too quickly could kill them, as their bodies couldn't process normal food after months or years of near starvation. The protocol required careful, gradual refeeding, but with thousands of desperate people and insufficient medical staff, implementing proper nutritional rehabilitation proved nearly impossible. Military records grimly note that many prisoners who'd survived years in the camps died within days of liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover, even with help finally available. The psychological impact on medical personnel was profound and well documented in later psychiatric studies. Post-war interviews with liberating forces revealed a common pattern. Medics who'd maintained emotional stability through years of battlefield trauma often experienced psychological breaks when confronting the camps. The systematic, deliberate nature of the suffering, this wasn't collateral damage from combat, but intentional atrocity, broke through defenses that combat experience had built. One medic who helped liberate Dachau, interviewed decades later for a historical archive, recalled that what haunted him most wasn't the visual horror, overwhelming as that was, but the smell. It permeated everything, got into clothing and lungs and memory. Years later, certain odors would trigger flashbacks to those days, trying to help people who were often beyond helping, witnessing evidence of cruelty that defied comprehension. But there was no time to process these experiences. The war was still being fought. Even as some medical units dealt with concentration camp survivors, others were treating casualties from the final battles in Germany. The fighting didn't become less intense just because the outcome was inevitable. German forces, though clearly defeated, often fought with desperation. Casualties continued until the very end, and medics continued treating them day after day, right up until the moment Germany surrendered. VE Day, Victory in Europe, came on May 8, 1945. For medics in the European theater, it meant the shooting had finally stopped. No more casualties, no more working under fire, no more watching soldiers die despite their best efforts. The relief must have been overwhelming, though mixed with exhaustion and the knowledge of how many hadn't lived to see this day. In the Pacific, the war ground on. The planned invasion of Japan promised to be the bloodiest operation of the entire war. Military planners estimated millions of casualties, both Japanese and American. Medical personnel prepared for a nightmare scenario, establishing field hospitals on beaches under fire, treating casualties on a scale that would dwarf anything they'd experienced, dealing with a fanatically resistant enemy that would fight to the last man. Medics stockpiled supplies, rehearsed procedures, and steeled themselves for what was coming. Then the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, and Japan surrendered. The invasion would never happen. For medical personnel who'd been preparing for it, the news brought relief so profound it was almost incomprehensible. They would live. They wouldn't have to endure one more horrific campaign, wouldn't have to treat thousands more casualties, wouldn't have to watch more soldiers die. It was over, but over is a relative term. Medical units still had work to do. Released prisoners of war needed treatment. Many had been held in brutal conditions and suffered from malnutrition, disease, and injuries, both old and new. Medics who'd spent years treating combat casualties now found themselves treating American soldiers who'd survived years in Japanese captivity, often in worse condition than many battlefield wounded. And then came the long journey home. Ships packed with returning soldiers crossed oceans that had so recently been war zones. On board, medical personnel continued their work, treating soldiers who'd fallen ill, dealing with minor injuries, addressing the psychological issues that were becoming more apparent as the adrenaline of combat wore off, and men had time to think about what they'd experienced. Returning home should have been triumphant, and in some ways it was. Crowds cheered, families reunited. Men who'd been gone for years finally came back to the lives they'd left behind. But for many medics, the transition was jarring. They'd spent months or years in an environment where their medical skills were essential, where they'd saved lives daily, where their work had clear, immediate meaning. Now they were back in a world that didn't need combat medics, where their experiences meant little, where people couldn't understand what they'd been through. Some medics went into civilian medicine, building on their wartime experience. The military's medical education programs had trained many, and the GI Bill made it possible for veterans to attend medical school or nursing programs. Hospitals and clinics welcomed healthcare workers with real-world experience, even if that experience had come from the battlefield rather than a traditional setting. Others wanted nothing to do with medicine. They'd seen enough blood, treated enough injuries, lost enough patients. They found jobs in entirely different fields, trying to build lives that had no connection to the war. Whether this helped them or hurt them, whether staying away from medical work allowed them to move past their trauma, or whether it meant they were running from experiences that needed to be processed, probably varied from person to person. The physical toll of combat medicine became apparent over time. Many medics had been wounded themselves. Medics were casualties like any other soldier, and their constant exposure to danger meant many were hit. Others carried less visible damage. Years of working under extreme stress, of going days without sleep, of physical labor, carrying wounded soldiers, lifting supplies, working in all weather, took a cumulative toll. Some medics found themselves dealing with chronic pain, with old injuries that never quite healed, with bodies that had been pushed too hard for too long. And then there were the diseases they'd been exposed to, particularly in the Pacific. Malaria recurred in many veterans, sometimes for years or decades after initial infection. The parasites could lie dormant in the liver, then emerge periodically to cause new episodes of fever and chills. Tropical diseases that had seemed minor annoyances during the war became chronic health problems afterward. Some medics dealt with persistent digestive issues from repeated bouts of dysentery. Others had respiratory problems from breathing in jungle mold and smoke. But the deepest damage was psychological. We've discussed combat stress, but it's worth returning to here in the context of how it affected medics' lives after they came home. Many found themselves unable to hold jobs, unable to maintain relationships, unable to function normally because they were haunted by memories of the war. Nightmares persisted for decades. Hypervigilance never fully faded. Certain sights, sounds, or smells would trigger flashbacks so intense that medics would find themselves transported back to the battlefield, reliving traumatic moments with visceral intensity. The silence about these struggles was almost universal. Men of that generation didn't talk about trauma or mental health. Shell shock, or battle fatigue, carried stigma. Admitting to psychological problems meant admitting weakness, or so the culture suggested. So medics suffered privately, told their families they were fine, drank to numb the memories, and tried to present a normal face to the world. Some succeeded better than others. Some built good lives, found meaning, made peace with their experiences. They could talk about the war when asked, but didn't dwell on it. Could remember the good parts, the camaraderie, the satisfaction of saving lives, without being consumed by the bad. These were the lucky ones, though lucky seems an odd word for anyone who'd experienced combat. Others never recovered. They went through multiple marriages, were unable to hold steady employment, struggled with substance abuse and depression. They'd survived the war physically, but couldn't survive its psychological aftermath. Some died young from various causes: accidents, alcohol-related diseases, suicide. The war claimed them years after the shooting stopped. But perhaps the most important twist in the medic's story, one that changes how we should understand everything we've discussed, came decades after the war ended. And it reveals that the price they paid was far greater than anyone realized at the time. Remember what we said at the beginning about emotional connection? About how the best medics were those who could remain emotionally present, who cared deeply about each casualty, who never became numb to suffering. Hold that thought. Starting in the 1980s, as researchers finally began systematically studying post-traumatic stress disorder, they made a discovery that shocked the military medical community. When they compared different military roles and their long-term psychological impacts, measuring PTSD symptom rates across various specialties, they found something completely unexpected. Medical personnel, including combat medics, consistently showed higher rates of PTSD symptoms than many direct combat roles, including infantry. Read that again. The men who didn't carry weapons, who were officially non-combatants, showed more psychological trauma than the soldiers who did the actual fighting. The numbers tell a stark story. According to research published in military psychology journals, combat medics and corpsmen reported PTSD symptoms at rates 1.5 to 2 times higher than infantry with similar levels of combat exposure. The difference wasn't subtle, it was statistically significant across multiple studies and multiple conflicts. But here's the revelation that recontextualizes everything we've learned. The very qualities that made someone an effective medic, the ability to remain emotionally connected, to care deeply about each casualty, to never become numb to suffering, were exactly the same qualities that left the deepest, most lasting psychological scars. Think about what this means. The medics we've celebrated for saving hundreds of thousands of lives paid a price that lasted 60, 70, 80 years. Many only received formal PTSD diagnoses in their 80s and 90s, finally getting recognition and treatment for trauma they'd carried privately for most of their adult lives. The nightmares that started on Omaha Beach or in the jungles of New Guinea never stopped for many of them. They just learned to live with them in silence, because their generation didn't have words for psychological injury, and seeking help was seen as weakness. An infantryman could psychologically distance himself from the enemy he killed. He might never learn their names, never see their faces clearly, never know if they had families waiting for them. That distance, while morally troubling in its own way, provided some psychological protection. Medic could never have that distance. He knew every casualty personally. He'd shared foxholes with them, knew their names, had seen pictures of their girlfriends and wives and children. When he worked on a wounded soldier, he wasn't treating an anonymous casualty. He was treating Joe, who'd shown him family photos just that morning. He was treating Frank, who'd shared his last cigarette. He was treating Mike, who'd promised to teach him to fish when they got home. When he saved someone, the joy was personal. When he failed, when the wounds were too severe, or the supplies ran out, or he simply ran out of time, the failure was personal too. Every soldier who died in his care haunted him. Every impossible triage decision, choosing to help this man while that man bled out, left a moral wound that never healed. This reveals something profound about the nature of trauma and compassion. The courage we've been celebrating wasn't just the physical bravery of running into fire, though that was real and extraordinary. It was also the courage to remain emotionally vulnerable and caring when psychological self-preservation would have suggested shutting down emotionally. It was the courage to keep caring about the 500th casualty as much as the first, to never become numb, to never stop seeing each wounded soldier as a human being who deserved every chance to live. They chose compassion over self-protection. Not once, but continuously, every day, with every casualty, for months or years, and they paid for that choice for the rest of their lives. The men we've celebrated for saving thousands of lives often paid a price that lasted 60 or 70 years. But that's not the end of the story. Because what happened next reveals something even more profound about these men and about the human capacity to find meaning in suffering. Despite their own untreated trauma, or perhaps because of it, many World War II medics became advocates for veteran mental health. They knew from personal experience what it meant to suffer psychological injury without adequate support or recognition. They'd lived with nightmares for decades, watched marriages fail, struggled with jobs, felt the isolation of carrying invisible wounds no one acknowledged. Drawing on that painful knowledge, they fought to ensure later generations wouldn't suffer the same way. When Vietnam veterans came home with PTSD, World War II medics were among those who pushed for better recognition and treatment. When Gulf War veterans, and then Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, faced similar struggles, these elderly medics, many now in their 70s and 80s, still carrying their own unhealed trauma, advocated for mental health services they themselves had never received. One former Navy corpsman, interviewed in 20 at age 91, explained it simply. "I couldn't fix what happened to me. 50 years of nightmares, that's not going away. But maybe I could help these younger guys not have to go through it alone, like I did." This pattern appears repeatedly in oral histories and veteran advocacy organizations. The medics who'd suffered most became the strongest voices for change. The generation denied mental health care fought harder than anyone to ensure later generations would receive it. Think about what this means. They took their trauma, the deepest, most painful experiences of their lives, and transformed it into advocacy that helped countless others. They couldn't undo their own suffering, couldn't erase 50 years of nightmares and hypervigilance and emotional distance from loved ones. But they could try to spare others the same silent agony. This is perhaps their most overlooked but most profound legacy. Not just the lives they saved in combat, but the lives they touched decades later by insisting that psychological wounds deserved recognition, that seeking help was strength, not weakness, that the military had a moral obligation to care for minds as well as bodies. Every modern military mental health program, every PTSD clinic, every effort to reduce the stigma around psychological injury, these exist partly because men who'd carried invisible wounds for half a century refused to let the next generation suffer in silence. They transformed their pain into purpose. They made meaning from trauma. They proved that even suffering, especially suffering, can be a catalyst for positive change if we choose to use it that way. And this fundamentally changes how we should understand their story. They weren't just victims of war's psychological toll. They were, in the end, victors over it. Not because they healed, many never fully did, but because they refused to let their trauma be meaningless. They gave it purpose by using it to help others. That may be the most courageous thing they did, more courageous in some ways than anything they did on the battlefield. This reveals something profound about trauma and the human spirit. Suffering doesn't have to destroy us or define us. It can, if we choose, become a source of wisdom, empathy, and motivation to prevent others from experiencing the same pain. The combat medics of World War II demonstrated this principle not through words, but through decades of advocacy for veterans they'd never met, wars they hadn't fought in, struggles they understood all too well. The legacy of World War II combat medics extends far beyond their individual experiences, reaching into how modern society understands military medicine, trauma, and the very definition of courage. They established the template for modern combat medicine, the principle that medical capability belongs at the absolute front of battle, that rapid treatment and evacuation save lives, that medics must train alongside the troops they'll serve. Today's military medical system, with its remarkable ability to save even catastrophically wounded soldiers, stands on the foundation these men built, often through desperate improvisation under fire. The advances in medicine that came partly from wartime medical research, antibiotics, blood transfusion techniques, trauma surgery protocols, understanding of shock and its treatment, became standard in civilian healthcare. Emergency medicine as a distinct specialty traces much of its approach to lessons learned on World War II battlefields. The golden hour concept, that outcomes improve dramatically when patients receive treatment within 60 minutes of injury, emerged from analyzing military medical data. Civilian paramedics, emergency departments, and trauma centers all reflect principles refined by combat medics working in muddy foxholes and hastily established aid stations. The psychological understanding of trauma that grew from studying combat stress has shaped how we approach PTSD broadly, regardless of its source. The recognition that trauma is an injury, not a weakness, that psychological wounds can be as debilitating as physical ones, that early intervention improves outcomes. These insights came partly from the experiences of men like the combat medics of World War II, even though they themselves often didn't benefit from that knowledge. But perhaps their most important legacy is more intangible and more profound. They proved that the impulse to heal can coexist with, and even triumph over, humanity's worst impulses toward violence and destruction. Every soldier they saved was an act of defiance against war's essential purpose. They were surrounded by people trying to kill, positioned at the absolute front of battle where death was the intended outcome, and they were trying to heal. That paradox, that contradiction, that stubborn insistence on valuing life in an environment designed to end it. That may be the most fundamentally human thing about the combat medic's role. And it's why, decades later, as the last of these men disappear, we should remember not just what they did, but what they chose to remain. Vulnerable, compassionate, and committed to saving life, even when everything around them was dedicated to taking it. The sun has set on that generation. The youngest World War II medics, if still living, are now centenarians. Within a few years, perhaps a decade at most, there will be none left who can describe from personal experience what it meant to be 19 years old, unarmed, running into machine gun fire because someone needed help. Their voices will fall silent. Their stories will pass into history, filtered through recordings and written accounts and the necessarily imperfect lens of retrospective understanding. Ray Lambert, the medic we met at the beginning of this story, the one who landed in the first wave at Omaha Beach, lived to be 100 years old. He died in April 2021. In his final years, he spoke at schools and veteran organizations, sharing his story. When a French schoolchild once asked if he still had nightmares about Normandy, Lambert answered honestly, "When I go to look at the beaches at Omaha, I remember all my friends that were killed there. And when I look at the channel and the water is rough, it seems at times that I can hear voices." That was 75 years after D-Day, 3/4 of a century, and he could still hear the voices of drowning men. But Lambert also said something else, something that captures the essence of what these men were. "I did what I was called to do. As a combat medic, my job was to save people and to lead others who did the same. I was proud of that job and remain so." Proud. Despite the trauma, despite the nightmares that never stopped, despite paying a psychological price for decades, he was proud. Because he'd saved lives, because he'd done what needed doing, because he'd chosen compassion when it would have been easier and psychologically safer to look away. That's what they all chose, these thousands of young medics. They chose the harder path, the path that would cost them more than they could have imagined. and they'd choose it again, most of them said, if they had to. Because some things are worth the cost. Some things matter more than our own comfort or safety or psychological well-being. Saving a life. That was worth it, even knowing the price. Even carrying it for 50, 60, 70 years. It was worth it. But their choice, to run towards suffering rather than away from it, to remain human in inhuman circumstances, to carry trauma so others might live, that choice echoes forward through time. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, compassion remains possible. That the decision to help, to heal, to value another person's life above your own safety represents a form of courage as valid as any found on the battlefield. That being unarmed doesn't mean being powerless when what you carry is knowledge, skill, and an unwavering commitment to preserving life. These are lessons worth remembering. These are stories worth preserving. Because the combat medics of World War II didn't just save lives in the 1940s, they demonstrated principles about human nature, about courage, about the power of compassion that remain relevant regardless of whether we face war or peace. Their legacy transcends the specific conflict they served in, offering timeless insights about what we're capable of when called to our best selves. If this story moved you, if it changed how you understand courage or compassion, or simply taught you something about a part of World War II that deserves more attention, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, histories that matter, that reveal unexpected truths, that deserve to be remembered before they're lost forever. Every like, every subscription helps ensure these stories reach people who need to hear them, who can learn from them, who might be inspired by them. And if you know a World War II veteran or their family, record their stories while there's still time. Listen to them, ask questions, preserve what they're willing to share. These voices will soon be silent, and when they are, stories and recordings and preserved memories are all we'll have left. Don't let this generation pass without capturing what they can teach us. Sleep well tonight, knowing that once, young men, most of them just teenagers, ran into hell armed with nothing but compassion and a canvas bag of medical supplies. They saved hundreds of thousands of lives. They witnessed horrors no human should have to see. They carried trauma for decades, often in silence, often without recognition or treatment. They proved that healing is its own form of courage, that compassion can be stronger than violence if we choose to make it so, that the decision to help others at cost to yourself represents perhaps the highest expression of human nature. Their war ended 80 years ago, but their legacy, their example of what's possible when ordinary people choose extraordinary compassion, that legacy endures. It challenges us, inspires us, reminds us of what we might become if we find the courage they showed. Not the courage to fight, but the harder courage to heal. Not the courage to survive, but the more difficult courage to remain vulnerable and caring in circumstances that would justify becoming hard and indifferent. That's their gift to us. That's what they proved was possible. And that's worth remembering, worth honoring, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges we face. Good night.